July 31st, 1760. The plains of Westphalia. 16,000 Allied soldiers faced an impossible choice. Let 20,000 French troops cross the Diemel River and march straight into the heart of Hanover, or attempt a desperate flanking manoeuvre that could end in complete disaster. Behind them lay the shame of Minden, where British cavalry had refused to charge when victory was within reach. Ahead lay French veterans positioned on commanding heights, blocking every approach to the vital river crossing. Between defeat and redemption rode one man whose personal courage would create a legend that echoes through British military tradition to this day. The Marquis of Granby adjusted his wig one final time as he surveyed the battlefield. In a few hours that wig would be gone, blown away by the wind of the wildest cavalry charge in British history. His bald head gleaming under the summer sun would become the symbol of British audacity, the moment when going bald-headed entered military legend as the ultimate expression of fearless attack. This is the story of Warburg, where British cavalry redeemed their honour through sheer brass-necked courage, where galloping artillery revolutionised battlefield tactics, and where one man's flying wig created a phrase that soldiers still use today. The 7 Years' War had reached a critical juncture by 1760, with European powers locked in a global struggle that would determine the future of empires. What had begun as a dispute over colonial boundaries in North America had exploded into a worldwide conflict spanning 4 continents. In Germany, the conflict centred on Westphalia, where French forces sought to capture Hanover and force Britain's King George II to sue for peace. This wasn't merely a regional campaign, but a crucial theatre that could determine the war's entire outcome. Hanover represented George II's ancestral homeland, and its loss would create unbearable political pressure in London for a negotiated settlement. French strategy recognised this vulnerability, concentrating substantial forces in Westphalia, while their opponents struggled with the logistics of defending a scattered electorate. The campaign of 1760 had begun badly for the Allied cause. French armies under the Duc de Broglie had captured several key fortresses, steadily tightening their grip on the approaches to Hanover's heartland. Each French success reduced Ferdinand's strategic options, while increasing pressure from London for decisive action to halt French progress. The strategic importance of Warburg lay in its position controlling the Diemel River, the last major barrier protecting Hanover's heartland. French Lieutenant General Le Chevalier de Mouy commanded approximately 20,000 troops positioned on the hills overlooking this vital crossing. His mission was straightforward: hold the heights, secure the river, and open the road to Hanover's capital. De Mouy's force represented the cream of French military might in Germany. His regiments included veteran Swiss units, renowned throughout Europe for their discipline and fighting ability. French line infantry had proven themselves in countless engagements across the continent, while their cavalry maintained reputations for elan that stretched back to Louis XIV's victories. These weren't raw recruits, but battle-tested professionals who had learned their craft in Europe's bloodiest theatres. Opposing him, Prince Ferdinand of Brunswick faced the challenge of his military career. His allied army, composed of Hanoverian, British, Hessian, and Brunswick troops, numbered only 16,000 men, significantly outnumbered and facing an enemy holding superior tactical positions. Ferdinand's plan required audacious timing and flawless execution, a complex flanking movement that would surprise the French while they remained confident in their defensive advantage. The British contingent of Ferdinand's army carried a burden heavier than their weapons. Barely a year had passed since the humiliation at Minden, where British cavalry under Lord George Sackville had refused orders to advance, watching helplessly as British infantry defeated French cavalry single-handedly. That refusal to charge had stained British military honour and cost them what should have been the most decisive victory of the war. The Minden disaster had created a crisis of confidence that extended far beyond the immediate military consequences. British public opinion, already critical of continental military involvement, had turned savage in its condemnation of cavalry cowardice. Parliamentary debates questioned whether British horsemen possessed the courage necessary for modern warfare, while foreign observers suggested that British cavalry had become soft through lack of proper continental experience. Sackville's court-martial had provided some satisfaction to those demanding accountability, but it couldn't erase the damage to regimental pride. British cavalry officers found themselves viewed with suspicion by their own infantry, who had achieved stunning victories while their mounted colleagues remained spectators. The psychological wounds ran deep, affecting everything from recruitment to tactical planning. More damaging than immediate military consequences was the impact on Allied cooperation. Prussian and Hanoverian commanders had begun excluding British cavalry from crucial operations, preferring to rely on their own mounted units rather than risk another Minden-style refusal. This marginalisation threatened to make British cavalry irrelevant to continental operations, undermining the entire rationale for their deployment. Command of British cavalry had passed to John Manners, Marquis of Granby, whose character embodied everything British soldiers admired in a leader. Unlike the typical aristocratic officer who purchased his commission and treated military service as a gentleman's hobby, Granby genuinely cared for his men's welfare. He used his personal fortune to provide for wounded veterans, often setting them up as publicans, which is why the Marquis of Granby remains one of England's most common pub names to this day. Granby's approach to military leadership challenged conventional aristocratic assumptions about the relationship between officers and men. Where most commanders maintained strict social distance from their subordinates, Granby visited wounded soldiers in field hospitals, learned their names and personal circumstances, and often intervened personally to resolve their problems. This hands-on leadership style created unprecedented loyalty among troops who recognised genuine concern for their welfare. More importantly for the coming battle, Granby possessed the aggressive instincts that Sackville had lacked. Where his predecessor saw obstacles and hesitated, Granby saw opportunities and acted. His reputation for leading from the front had already earned him his soldiers' devotion, but Warburg would test whether courage alone could overcome tactical disadvantage. The morning of July 31st found both armies positioned for what appeared to be a conventional engagement. French forces occupied the Hanover, a strategically crucial hill, crowned with a tower that dominated the surrounding countryside. From this position, they could observe and counter any Allied approach to the Diamel crossing. French defensive arrangements reflected decades of European military experience. Dumois had positioned his elite Swiss regiments on the most vulnerable approaches, knowing their discipline could withstand sustained assault. French line infantry occupied supporting positions, while cavalry reserves remained ready to exploit any Allied weakness. Artillery batteries commanded every avenue of approach, their guns pre-sighted on likely target areas. The French position appeared virtually impregnable to conventional assault. Attacking uphill against prepared positions violated every principle of 18th century military science, promising heavy casualties for minimal gain. Most commanders would have sought alternative approaches or settled for blockading French forces until supply problems forced their withdrawal. Ferdinand's plan depended on achieving complete tactical surprise. While maintaining the appearance of a frontal assault, he would secretly manoeuvre his forces around the French left flank, using morning mist to conceal his movement. The Earprince, Brunswick's hereditary prince, would lead this flanking force to capture the Hanover from behind, collapsing French positions before they could react. The complexity of this operation challenged 18th century military capabilities. Coordinating multiple columns across difficult terrain while maintaining communications and timing required exceptional staff work and disciplined execution. A single mistake could expose the flanking force to destruction or alert French defenders to Allied intentions. The plan's greatest weakness lay in timing. If the flanking movement was discovered too early, French forces could crush it in detail. If it arrived too late, Ferdinand's remaining troops would face impossible odds in a frontal assault. Success required split-second coordination across multiple columns, moving through difficult terrain under enemy observation. Weather conditions favoured Allied plans as thick morning mist reduced visibility across the battlefield. This natural screen would conceal Allied movements while hampering French observation, but it also complicated Allied coordination by making unit identification nearly impossible. Officers would need to rely on prearranged signals and careful reconnaissance to maintain proper formations. As dawn broke, Ferdinand's gamble began to pay off. The Prince's flanking force, moving through thick morning mist, reached the base of the Heinberg undetected. Swiss and French defenders on the summit, confident in their impregnable position, found themselves attacked from behind by Allied infantry who had seemingly materialised from nowhere. The psychological impact of this surprise was immediate and devastating. French soldiers who had spent the morning preparing for frontal assault suddenly found enemies attacking from their supposedly secure rear areas. The carefully planned defensive arrangement collapsed as units turned to face unexpected threats, creating gaps and confusion throughout their entire position. The surprise was complete, but French resistance was fierce. Elite Swiss regiments, renowned throughout Europe for their battlefield discipline, fought desperately to maintain their positions. These weren't conscripts who would flee at the first sign of trouble, but professional soldiers whose reputation depended on holding ground regardless of circumstances. Hanoverian battalions struggled up steep slopes under heavy fire, taking casualties with every yard gained. The battle's outcome hung in the balance, as both sides committed their reserves to the fight for the commanding heights. It was at this critical moment that Ferdinand recognised the need for immediate cavalry intervention. The infantry assault had succeeded in dislodging French defenders, but lacked the momentum to complete their destruction. French forces were beginning an orderly withdrawal toward the Diemel, threatening to escape with their army intact. Without immediate cavalry pursuit, this tactical success would yield no strategic advantage. Ferdinand's order to Granby was desperate in its urgency, but clear in its intent: strike immediately, regardless of conditions or conventional tactical wisdom. The message reached British cavalry positions approximately 5 miles from the main engagement, where Granby's regiments had been positioned as reserves awaiting developments. There was no time to wait for infantry support or coordinate with other units. The moment demanded exactly the kind of headlong charge that military manuals warned against: a desperate dash across broken ground against an enemy who still possessed superior numbers. The distance to the battlefield presented its own challenges. 5 miles of rough Westphalian countryside lay between Granby's starting position and the French rear guard. Maintaining formation cohesion, while covering this distance at speed, would test the training and endurance of both horses and riders. Many commanders would have hesitated, seeking better conditions or additional support before committing to such a risky advance. What happened next entered British military legend. Granby's horsemen, Royal Horse Guards known as the Blues, Dragoon Guards, and traditional dragoons, surged forward at full gallop across the Westphalian countryside. The pace was so furious that Granby's hat and powdered wig were blown clean off his head by the rushing wind. The sight of nearly 1,000 British cavalry thundering across the German countryside created a spectacle that witnesses would remember for decades. These weren't the light cavalry used for reconnaissance and skirmishing, but heavy shock troops mounted on powerful war horses specifically bred for battlefield impact. Each horse carried not just its rider, but also the accumulated weight of weapons, equipment, and armour necessary for sustained combat. For an 18th century gentleman and officer, losing one's wig in public represented a serious breach of military dignity. Yet Granby never hesitated, never slowed to retrieve his fallen headgear. Instead, he continued leading the charge, with his bald head gleaming in the July sun, creating an image of such magnificent audacity that his men would never forget it. The physics of cavalry impact made Granby's charge devastating when it finally struck French positions. 1,000 horses and riders, each weighing collectively over half a ton, striking enemy formations at 20 miles per hour, created kinetic energy sufficient to shatter virtually any infantry formation. The psychological effect was equally important. The thunder of hooves, clouds of dust, and sight of British cavalry bearing down with sabres drawn could break enemy morale even before physical contact. French cavalry, caught while attempting to cover their army's withdrawal, simply disintegrated under British impact. Veteran regiments that had fought across Europe broke and fled toward the Diemel, abandoning positions they had held all morning. The psychological effect was as important as the physical. Seeing their elite cavalry routed shattered French confidence throughout their entire army. The pursuit that followed showcased why cavalry remained the decisive arm in 18th century warfare. Once French formations began retreating, Granby's horsemen hunted them mercilessly across the countryside, preventing any attempt to rally or establish new defensive lines. What had begun as an orderly withdrawal became a rout, with French casualties mounting rapidly as they fled toward the river crossing. Supporting Granby's charge was an equally revolutionary development in artillery tactics. Captain William Phillips achieved something previously considered impossible, moving field guns at cavalry speed across broken terrain. His gun crews, riding their limbers at breakneck speed, kept pace with Granby's charging cavalry while maintaining control of their weapons. This innovation provided the foundation for what would become the Royal Horse Artillery, established in 1793, proving that artillery could provide dynamic battlefield support wherever the action was hottest. The combination of Granby's cavalry charge and Phillips's galloping guns created a devastating 1-2 punch that shattered French resistance completely. Infantry provided the initial breakthrough, cavalry exploited it ruthlessly, and artillery prevented any French recovery. This coordination between arms became a hallmark of British military doctrine for generations afterward. The battle's conclusion was as dramatic as its climax. French forces, having lost their commanding positions and suffered crushing cavalry defeat, abandoned their planned Diemel crossing entirely. What should have been a strategic advance into Hanover became a hasty retreat back toward French-controlled territory. The speed of French collapse surprised even Allied commanders who had planned the operation. Dumouriez's army, which had appeared so formidable that morning, disintegrated under the combined pressure of infantry assault, cavalry pursuit, and artillery bombardment. Units that had fought together for years scattered across the Westphalian countryside, abandoning equipment and supplies in their desperation to escape British pursuit. Casualty figures reflected the completeness of Allied victory. French losses totaled approximately 3,000 men, 1,500 killed or wounded, 1,500 captured, plus artillery pieces and military equipment abandoned during the retreat. Allied losses were significantly lighter, demonstrating the effectiveness of Ferdinand's flanking strategy and Granby's decisive cavalry action. The psychological damage to French military prestige extended far beyond immediate casualties. News of Warburg's defeat reached French commanders throughout Germany, undermining confidence in their army's invincibility while encouraging greater Allied aggression in subsequent operations. French strategic planning became increasingly defensive as commanders sought to avoid similar disasters. More importantly than immediate casualties, the battle restored British military prestige after Minden's humiliation. Granby's charge proved that British cavalry could match any troops in Europe when properly led and motivated. The psychological impact extended far beyond Warburg itself, influencing French strategic planning throughout the remainder of the 7 Years' War. International observers took careful note of British performance at Warburg, particularly the combination of tactical innovation and aggressive leadership that had achieved such decisive results. Prussian commanders, previously sceptical of British cavalry capabilities, began seeking greater integration with Allied mounted units. Austrian military theorists studied the battle as an example of how individual courage could overcome numerical disadvantage. Warburg established tactical principles that transformed British warfare for generations. The coordination between Granby's cavalry charge and Philip's galloping guns became standard British doctrine, eventually producing the horse artillery units that distinguished themselves throughout the Napoleonic Wars. Ferdinand's flexible defensive strategy became a model for continental campaigns where smaller professional armies faced larger conventional forces, while the battle proved that individual courage and aggressive leadership could overcome numerical disadvantage. The cultural impact proved equally lasting. Granby's practice of using his personal wealth to support veterans, setting them up as publicans, created the Marquis of Granby pub names that remain common across England today. Going bald-headed entered everyday English as a metaphor for attacking problems directly, carrying connotations of honest determination that reflect British military values. The Blues gained lasting privileges, including the right for officers to salute superiors while bareheaded, commemorating their commander's famous charge. The Battle of Warburg stands as testament to what British military culture achieved at its finest. Technical innovation guided by moral courage, tactical flexibility informed by strategic wisdom, and individual heroism serving collective purpose. Granby's gleaming head led them into legend, proving that sometimes the best way forward is simply going bald-headed at whatever stands in your way.